Welcome to the BEZA Performance live stream. Today is S&OP Thursday, so we'll have Doug Dedman of DBM Systems, my friend and colleague and thought leader for S&OP. Welcome back, Doug.
Oh, good to be back, Marshall.
This is the third installment in the What Does Good Look Like series that we're doing regarding S&OP. So, Doug, what are you covering today?
Well, today we're going to we kind of laid out kind of 8 areas to look at what does good look like, and today we're actually going to be talking about the monthly process.
Okay, so the meeting flow, what happens?
Absolutely. Yep.
Pretty important stuff. Also important, I think, is to kind of level set. Let me do that real quick. We believe that S&OP is the president's handle on the business, or whoever owns both operations or supply and demand sales, perhaps. So that person needs to be able to participate in creating that link between strategy and execution, and setting the flow rate for the business by family. So this is an active process, not a report out to the president. They need to be able to establish clear, responsible, and accountable functions for every part of the S&OP process. The process should be regular, repeatable as a management process, and measurable in terms of producing actionable improvements both for itself and the business. So the more you use S&OP, the better you get at S&OP, and the better the business gets.
Yep.
So why don't I kick it over to you, Doug, and I'll pop your screen up here real quick.
Yeah, no, and it just was interesting as you were going through that. You think of, where our topics that we've been going through is like, what does good look like? And we'd identify these 8 areas.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to level set what we're talking about back to the outcomes that we're thinking that we should get out of the S&OP process. And so we had basically identified these 8 kind of major areas. We covered family structure in our last session. And so this session, we really want to focus on the monthly process and how does it fit into that? And I thought it'd be good to maybe go back to a couple of the questions that, for people that are watching this and are thinking about is like, how well does your executive S&OP process work? Well, what kind of questions could I ask myself to think about, does it work well or not? And the first one, and this will be an important one for today, is your executive S&OP meeting a report out or a decision-making meeting? So everything we're going to talk about in the process is how do we get ourselves to that point so that it's a report out, or it's not a report out, but it's a decision-making meeting. And then the other part is, how do you get yourself to the point that you can get through the entire business in 1 to 1.5 hours? A lot of that depends on having a good lead up to the process as well, right?
Yeah.
And another real important one, does everyone walk out of the executive S&OP meeting on the same page, and are they ready to execute the plan? And then finally, is your senior executive actually engaged in the meeting, right? And by that, in many ways, I look at that and say, hey, are they the one that's leading the meeting, or who's actually leading that meeting? And so I think if you ask yourself these questions, and if you could say yes to all of these, right, I think you've got a good process that's working. If you can't, what we're trying to cover off is the areas that really kind of dovetail into that and say, well, here's some things you should think about as to how do I get myself to that point.
Well, and maybe a little bit of having kind of seen some of the stuff you use, some ways to get a little deeper into those questions and be a little more nitty gritty on discerning how good you are at a given category.
Right. Exactly. And yeah, when I think about the monthly process, really 3 areas that I'd like for us to chat through today. One is just, what are the steps of the monthly process? The second one, probably pretty important, it goes back to the racy side of, accountability and what are the outcomes of each step of the process. And then some ideas on how you can measure cycle adherence. And I'm a big proponent that, you got to measure it. Otherwise you're, how do you know you're doing well? And that means you have to have an expectation of, okay, what's good in terms of the process, right? So, yeah, so that's kind of what I'd like to go through on the monthly process. So, Marshall, and you've seen this, I don't know how many times, right? This monthly process planning cycle. And for those that have done kind of any reading on the S&OP process, the executive S&OP process, this should be a pretty standard chart. You've got a end of month, right, where I capture all of my data, and that's really a standard piece. And then really I go through a cycle of meetings, and there might be more additional pieces, but the fundamental pieces that have to happen is there's a demand meeting, there's a pre S&OP supply meeting, there is a pre S&OP meeting, which is really kind of the reconciliation of demand and supply and resolving kind of any issues there that culminate in the meeting that we were talking about at the beginning of this, that executive S&OP meeting, which is where that senior executive is able to make the call, able to see the plans, and everything really leads up to that final step there in there where I publish the S&OP plan. So this is really what we're going to be talking through in terms of the cycle. It's interesting because everything starts, and I don't think I put anything in my talk on the end of month processing, but to me it's pretty interesting. You have to collect the data before you start the process, and I'm a big proponent of saying this process has to be reflective of the planning data that you are using in your system, and reflective of the actuals that are happening in your system, because it's a measurement back to what you thought was going to happen,
Right.
and what actually happened. And it's got to be reflective of the best view of your plans going forward, which are stuff that's in your ERP system, right? And so when I think of the process starting, this end of month process is really the step that everything starts with, in terms of being able to run through this the process.
So a lot of our clients don't start the pre S&OP demand meeting right at the beginning of the month, but they've got that snapshot of data that they capture at the same time every month, so that they get the same picture every
Yep.
month of something. They're measuring the same things at the same time during the month.
Right. And if you think, we always talk about a balanced plan, right? And if you think of the way information moves through your planning system, but also through your plan, right? When I book something, that booking, that new order that came in, it needs to appear in my backlog, right? And when I ship something, it's going to take something out of inventory, and it's going to ship it, and it's going to remove that from the backlog. And so I want to capture all that information as close to the end of the month, or the beginning of the following month. And I need to capture it all at the same time, because that gives me a balanced snapshot of what's happened. Everything's kind of moved from one bucket to the next, right? Booking went to, potentially a shipment, or booking went to my backlog, went to a shipment, because I've shipped something out of inventory. You get the picture, right? Everything's got to really move in the right places. So, yeah,
Sounds
an
like a
important.
5-section sheet.
It's the 5-section sheet, and you'll see a few examples of that as we go through. So I thought what I would do, if it makes sense, Marshall, is just maybe walk through
Please.
um, each one of these meetings, just with a little bit of a sense of what we would expect to have happen and what the outcomes are. And so if I think about that demand planning meeting, the outcome of that is the unconstrained demand plan. And I think about that really three things, right? It's my bookings, it's my shipments, and it's my backlog. And I'm going to do that or I want to be able to view that by demand stream.
So
Okay.
let's just again, I know we do this every time. If folks have watched several of these, they might get sick of it, but bookings is our term for the orders as they're coming in, or as you're planning them to come in. Shipments would be when they're shipped, obviously, but some people call shipment sales, and um, there's a lot of different terminology, but just a level set, I think.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And
Yep.
then
No, I think,
backlog is
go
typically
ahead.
not, well, backlog's typically not late. I mean, it could be late backlog, but what we're really talking about is your planned backlog with that, or
Right.
forward
That's
log, some people call it.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay.
So if you think about it this way, when I book something, I increase my backlog or increase my open orders. And when I ship something, I decrease my backlog or decrease my open orders. Now, that might all happen in one day for some business, right?
Yeah.
But it might be, I book something and I'm not going to ship it for 4 or 5 months. And so it sits in my backlog until, I get to that 4 or 5 months later. And so that unconstrained demand plan needs to include all of those, and it's by demand stream. Now, I'll go through accountability and responsibility in a checklist, and I'll make a couple comments that might address some misconceptions about this meeting. So the if you think about it, I'm trying to come up with that unconstrained demand plan and by demand stream. So I'm not thinking about this necessarily as, oh, I'm planning each individual customer. I'm doing this by demand stream. And you have to go back. This is probably an important point to say. The demand streams would be kind of like your key group of customers, right? It could be where I've selected my project demand as well as my flow demand, right? So we will say the most you ever want is kind of 8 segmentations of that per family,
Yeah.
because otherwise you get it. Otherwise, you're into detailed demand planning. The
Demand
demand,
streams are not families. That's not what we're talking about, folks. We're
right?
talking
They
about the
they are
flow from, yeah,
right. They're that view underneath the family. That's more of a market facing view.
yeah,
But you typically aren't going down to the individual customer level. You might have your top 3 customers or
yeah,
something like that.
OEMs or something.
Your OEMs, yeah, exactly. And on that, so that's an important thing. So the demand planning meeting is not, the detailed demand planning. It's where you take the output of your detailed demand planning, whether that's a statistical forecast, whether that's you've got Salesforce and you're capturing opportunities in there. I mean, there's all the stuff that you go through, whether there's a consensus building demand process. This is about taking that all together, kind of summing it up by those demand streams within the project, within the product family, and you're essentially validating and agreeing that that plan makes sense. And it, so it means there's some work that really should be going on before this meeting, and sometimes that would bleed into the previous month, right? But one of the big things that happens in this meeting, and one of the checklist items that comes out of that, is you review last month's performance. Because if you think about this, I put a plan together the previous month. Everything happened in the month, and now I'm thinking about, did what I expect to happen? I'm validating my bookings, I'm validating my shipments, I'm looking at where my backlog ended up and saying, hey, are we really tracking to where we thought we would be tracking? And so part of that is going back and checking your risks and assumptions from last time,
Well, and
right?
if not, why not? Was it your risks and
Right.
assumptions manifesting or something you didn't see?
Or something completely out of the blue, right? Right? Like there was a project that came in that we were not expecting at all,
Mhm.
and so it happened there, right?
So this reminds me of a client we had that was they couldn't even do that. They couldn't look at last month's. It wasn't a fruitful exercise because of the way they.
Oh, Marshall, I think, can you hear me still, Marshall? You just
Sorry, that's me. I muted for just safety's sake in case I dropped something, and then I thought maybe that wasn't my best idea, but um, yeah. So what I was getting at is this reminds me of a client you and I had that they could not go look at last month's performance. They could, but it didn't help because the way they did their planning, it was like starting from scratch every month, and so it wasn't fruitful to do that. So really, your planning process for demand should, or any of these sections on the 5 section sheet, should allow you to go review your last month's. That's where the assumptions and risks comes in. You can
Yep.
think about what happened, and then it should get easier over time. I mean, you get curveballs like COVID and things like
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
but you're not creating curveballs within your own process. Your process has got clear thinking about what's happening so that you can decide whether or not that thinking needs modified.
Right, right. And I think the important part of this is that you are, you're doing this at the demand stream level. So you've done the detailed demand planning, that you needed to, and you're going to check the reasonable, how reasonable is that overall demand plan, right? Like, does it actually make sense? You're going to update those risks and assumptions. So you need to have that ability to measure back to what you thought was going to happen, and to look at it at a level of granularity that is not, customer by customer by customer, right? It
Or
might be,
SKU, no
yeah, or
SKU level
SKU for
work.
sure, right?
Yeah.
Because the real check on this is to say, well, does it make sense? And that historical view is so important because, often we'll see, demand historically is here, and we look at month one forecast for shipments and bookings, and it's like 2x, and you're like, well, somebody explain to me what's changing this month that the demand is 2 times where it was, because those seismic shifts don't always happen. And I'm working with a customer right now where they're kind of in a downturn right now, just in terms of where they're seeing some demand in one of their families, and it's almost like they the demand is here and their prediction is way down here. And it's kind of a question, the challenge to them is it's probably more like a slow decline on that particular product family. But until you actually put the plan together and you look at it, it's you don't get that sort of sober second thought. So I always think about S&OP to a certain sense of, it's the step back from the fray, right? That day to day sort of stuff. Take a look at what that plan looks like, and then make sure that's what we want to have happen. And so, if I want to make any adjustments, I do that at that demand stream level. So, if I've
Yeah.
got statistical forecast that's coming in and I've got my backlog view, and those two things just don't line up, I want to adjust the plan in here to come up with what I think that demand plan looks like. Now, that may mean I've got to go out and make some adjustments to my other planning processes, but that's a big
Right.
part of what you should be doing.
Well, and that's what we said that should be happening, right?
Right.
That's kind of part of step 5 here. We or part 5. We think that you should be able to improve your results
Right.
using S&OP. So you should get better at demand planning.
Yep. Yep. And so if I think about it, if I roll forward to the 5 section sheet, which we talked about, right? So this is that model that really forces us to pull all that data together. So the bookings being the orders that came in, shipments being what I shipped out, my backlog. Really, there's two elements to my backlog. I've got my age backlog, which my current position, and then I've got a forward-looking projected backlog, which is
Mhm.
basically the difference between my bookings and my shipments. And I won't focus on the bottom parts of this,
Right.
because in the demand meeting, I'm really focused on these top parts of this at a level. This is showing it at the family level. I would do this a level below that at the demand stream level. And I'm really validating that if you look here, the month that we came out in this example I have here was February. I have my actuals, which is this number here, compared to what my plan was last month. I have my actual shipments compared to what my plan was. And if it's out of tolerance, I would expect a reason. And we always think it's valuable to be able to see that in the past, because when I put the plans together going forward, I want to check, are they reasonable, right? Do I have a huge step change month over month? Like, so you can see this as an example. I've got a shipment plan where I believe that number, it's pretty small on my screen, but I think it's just over 2,000. And I've got it almost doubled in the following month, right? And so that's one of those questions of, is that a valid shipment plan? I'm not quite sure, right? And in this case, yeah, it was. But that is part of the question as we go into this, right? So all of this is to develop kind of the first part of that, which is the unconstrained sales plan. And it's at the demand stream. And we'll talk a little bit about the constrained plan as we go through the process. Couple
Okay.
other quick points on demand
Please.
planning. You want to do this without the operations folks driving the discussion. And the reason I say that is because by nature, they're going to want to constrain the plan immediately. And so part of this is you want to have that unconstrained view, because this is really where do we think it could go, and where do we
Yeah.
want to put that in there. We're going to have to constrain it, but you really want to look at that and say, well, what does the unconstrained view look? And that's where those demand streams are pretty important too.
And just another quick emphasis that we're cutting this off after a few months only to fit it on the screen. We would
Yes.
never have a 5 section sheet or an S&OP plan, including the demand side of things, that goes less than a rolling 12.
Yeah.
So it doesn't sunset with your business, your fiscal year, your business plan, and it is never less than 12, because you got to be thinking about the future. So when Doug mentions demand planning, we're talking about planning, in the future, not the next 3 months.
Yeah, very good point. Thanks, Marshall. I never even thought of that as I put this up. I did it for
Yeah.
clarity's sake, not so much to. So good. So hopefully that gives you kind of an understanding of the demand meeting, which then rolls into the next meeting, which is the supply planning meeting. And in that supply planning meeting, now we're going to agree to what that supply plan is. And now, not at the demand stream level, right? Not by those. We're doing this by family and site. And if you tuned in last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago, when we talked about the family structure, it's so important that that family structure, your product families, that your S&OP families that you look at, they need to be by constraint, right? Because
Yeah.
I've just done my unconstrained demand planning, but I need to aggregate that to a family that's by constraint, because essentially I'm going to have to do some math to figure out what is my forward looking plan. And it's going to be it's the top level of that's going to be my capability, right? That's as high as I can go, and I can only consume whatever inventory I have, right? So I've got to float between those two numbers always.
So when we say constraint, I always try to emphasize this. We're not talking about some sort of bottleneck breaking micro constraint. This is a line. This is a value stream. This is it might be a primary vendor that constrains,
Yep.
because you buy, you don't make, and that's the idea behind the constraints there. But this would be, I think, a distinctive that makes our approach unique. DBM kind of came up with this as a emphasis, and that is that if you can't, buy it or make it, you can't ship it. So
Right.
families are based on constraints. The market facing view of the world comes through the demand stream model, not the family model.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why it's so important what I said before, that operations can be in the demand meeting, but I'm always very cautious, because if they start taking over the demand meeting, then it becomes immediately we go to constraining, right?
Sure.
And it's also the important part, and I'll talk about this when we see the 5 section sheet again. It's why we include both shipments and production. I mean, there's been many places that we've worked with where, okay, yeah, we do a bookings forecast and we do a shipping forecast, but we don't do a production forecast because we don't carry any inventory. Yeah, okay, except that you've got to have a plan of what you think you're going to produce, what's going to come off the line, and most places will carry a certain amount of inventory because it just didn't get out the door,
Yeah.
and so you got to make sure you capture that. So
Good.
the checklist on the supply planning meeting is really almost the same as the demand plan. Review last month's performance. And so that's that check of plan against actual. That means you have a committed to production plan, right? Not a committed to shipping plan for this, but an actual production plan. And so if I don't make the production plan, well, that's on operations and supply chain typically, right? Because that's that's the issue. Unless I didn't get the orders in, which I would see on the booking side of things, and there's some measurements we use around that as well. We we check our ability to support the unconstrained demand plan, update those risks and assumptions in our supply side, and approve that supply plan. And so on the 5 section sheet, and you might have to move us off so we can see those last two sections down there, Marshall. We're focused on the bottom part of this, and we're really focused on developing this supply line, right? Which is my supply plan going forward. And to your point, that's going to go out 12 months. And that supply plan is constrained by my capability, right? And I'm going to be watching my inventory plan, because if my supply plan is under my capability and it's, which is good, but it's well below what my shipping forecast, unconstrained shipping forecast, I'm going to see the difference down here in a negative inventory number. And so by putting all of this together in the 5-section sheet, and this one happens to be a balanced plan, but by putting it all together on a 5-section sheet, I can quickly see where my supply plan is not capable of hitting my shipping unconstrained shipping plan, and I know I've got to constrain. And so that's important.
Yeah, that's where I mean, the whole basis of the way we think about this is to be able to know what the right questions are to ask about the constraints. So you've got to be able to see them
Yep.
clearly,
Yep.
numerically.
And
And that
and
includes
and
the executive, right? So we're really asking the executive to either bless or alter the constrained shipment plan. That's what we're trying to do
right.
with a
Right.
five section. I mean, that's the technical way you could describe what we're doing when we talk about setting the flow rate. That's kind of it.
And I would say the other thing you'd look at, so it's not just on the constraint, but if I looked at my production plan and if it was significantly under my capability, that would potentially mean I have capital resources, that are underutilized for this particular family. And so then it's kind of a question of, how should I right size that, right? Because that might mean we are sitting with that excess capability and capacity, and that might be better utilized someplace else, or maybe we've got to look at how do we expand that sales business. So such a rich view when you start
Right.
thinking about it. Like it sometimes it even blows my mind because it's like,
Yeah, we're looking at a 5-section sheet that most people think you shouldn't show to an executive because it's too complicated or something. Yet and I would point out too, that's what the 12-month rolling or longer is about, right? Because
right.
you're not just looking at the next 3 months, you're looking at unutilized capacity for 12 months. Then what are we doing there? And that
Yep.
becomes a capital conversation. So
Yeah. And
good
and
stuff.
if I look at it, much like on the demand side, just as we were talking about, you've got your weekly master scheduling meetings, you probably have your daily crisis meetings that you have. All of that informs what you bring up to the S&OP meeting. And the a lot of this is, and it should be, looking beyond month one and looking at month two and beyond, because month one, and you've heard me say this many times, the die is cast, right? Like it's month one, especially on the operation side, is typically all set.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you've got to react to some things that are going on, but for the most part, you're going to be looking at what is out in the future, right?
And there are folks with businesses where maybe that's not as true as most businesses, but it's still, man, the vast majority of businesses we work with have. I mean, we just talked to a huge organization, multi-billion-dollar company. It's got 2-week lead times for shipments, but that's because they're able to run inventory first of all. So it's not their supply chain
Yep.
lead time, and they're constrained right now. So at least a half of month one is kind of a big deal, and
Yep.
it's already in their backlog. So
Yep. And in that, the plans you made to get the rest of that, you kind of had to have that in process because
right,
most of your supply chain isn't able to respond to 2 weeks, right? And so you've got to be thinking about the inelasticity, is the term I would use for that, of that whole
sure.
supply chain. So, anyways, let me roll forward here and talk about the pre S&OP meeting. And really, this is the balancing meeting, if you will, right? So now I'm basically focused on what is my proposed constrained shipping plan, my production, my inventory, my capability plans. I didn't include bookings on there. Bookings really, once I've done my unconstrained plan, that really, we typically kind of hold our bookings there because that's what sales thinks they can get. Now you might go and change that a bit as well, but typically we're basically going through and constraining this and have these outputs. We do it by family and site, and you're really preparing the family presentations. And really, the accountability and responsibility, this is really now where we are now crossing between the VP of sales and the VP of operations. And then the responsibilities of the S&OP coordinator. And if I look at a checklist for this, you're finalizing the plan, identifying any unresolved issues. If I've got to do some constraining, you're now talking about allocation, right? You might be talking about, boy, if I'm constraining now, I might be thinking about, okay, where can we start to move the capability up, and what do we want to be proposing in terms of that? And really kind of coming up with the story for each family, and then finalizing the risks and assumptions. And so now I'm basically looking at that full 5-section sheet and saying, do I have a balanced plan, right? Am I running negative
Mm.
inventory? Okay, then I haven't got a balanced plan yet, right? Is I can look at my age backlog against my shipping plan now to say, well, oh, am I going to be pushing orders out, right? And starting to prepare for this. But that is a big part of that, is coming up with that now, that agreed upon plan in preparation for the executive S&OP meeting. And so that you're getting that whole story together so that you can then roll into the executive S&OP meeting. Going back to my comment about saying that executive S&OP meeting is 1.5 to an hour, and you want to have that completely, able to do in that period of time. It means you got to put your stuff together ahead of time.
Yeah.
And we also are strong proponents of saying you need to get the deck out well in advance of the meeting so that people can come in prepared. And I would say that applies to every single one of these meetings, is that the
Yeah.
data is ready ahead of time. So when you
Couple
come in,
days.
I say 24 hours,
Yeah.
because you just want to give people time to dig into the data, take a look at it. And, if you're like me, I often don't have the necessarily all the questions before I go into that meeting, but at least I've familiarized myself with the data, and I can come in and it's not like, I'm getting hit with a bunch of numbers and I can't
Right.
consume the numbers. But I like to go through, and spend a few minutes on each family and go, yeah, does it kind of make sense? Now I read 5-section sheets all the time, so I'm pretty quick. But I've now worked with some presidents who they're just as quick.
Sure.
You go through, and once you coach them a bit, they really get that.
2
So
months and they're good to
yep,
go.
2 months, and they can get there, absolutely. So the executive S&OP meeting is that 1.5 to an hour to hour and a half. You're going through the agreed on plans by site, and identified actions, and you're signing off on the plan. Right? We always say the president at the end says, "Do I approve these plans?" Or the S&OP coordinator asks the president. The president says yes. In a workflow that we use, we actually have you sign off on that as the final step of the workflow.
Yeah.
The accountability and responsibility for this: accountability is to the executive ownership, and responsibility for the meeting happening and making sure it's going, is the S&OP coordinator. And the checklist I use, and our next topic that we do will be on the executive S&OP presentation, but you can think about this as the family by family review. Any issues that need resolution are presented. It's the proposed plan that the team came up with, that they're saying this is what we think is going to happen, or what we think has to happen. And then anything that hasn't been resolved, that's where you need a decision. Any action items are captured, and you've got to sign off on the plan. And that's really the monthly process. Um,
Well
the
done.
a couple. Oh, go ahead.
Well, and I think you have some scorecarding and stuff that we use that
Yeah.
helps establish, how you're doing with regard to getting all that done. Oh, good.
Yep.
Here it is. Yep.
Yeah. So one of the things that I like to do, and this is an important one, is think about documenting your process, and by that I mean document what is the meeting cycle. I didn't show it on here, but I like to lay the schedule out. I think you should do that 6 to 12 months in advance. And then you're really setting the expectation of who is in each meeting. So we use just a real simple thing. We say, who's accountable. That's the person who's, making sure that they've got the final call out of that meeting. So we think about that demand meeting. That one, really, we've got the VP of sales accountable for the outcome of that. My responsible person in this case, we've just got it as the demand planner. So they're the ones who just make sure it's all happening. And then informed might be who else would be in the meeting. So this isn't a full list right now, but we document that. That gives us a way to say, well, did we have the people in the meeting that we should have, right? So just a simple sort of checklist for each of those meetings. Who's accountable? I like to also, because it's unrealistic to think that the accountable person's always going to be there. You should have a
Yeah.
designate or a delegate who's also identified for that. So just a simple way to measure that. And then we use that for some scorecarding. That this is part of really three major things we look at. We look at uh, the participation in the process. We look at the data in the process, and we look at the repeatability, or does the process happen all the time? And so this is the scorecard criteria that we use for that. So you can see participation, data, and the schedule. And then we simply, on this rubric, score you as um, really good on all of those. You're in somewhere in the middle, and this needs improvement. And so over
Yeah. One is
time,
a zero in this model.
we don't do a zero in this one. We do,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
we do. We
Participation effort
Yeah,
counts.
yeah, and you can see on here we say, hey, if the owner's not there, right, then you score a one. That's if the owner or their delegate is not there.
Right.
Now, if the owner or delegate is there, but you have less than 80% of the people that you plan to have on that scores yellow. And then the other one here is we've got full or 80% of the key players, and then we look
Or
at
their delegates.
or their delegates, right?
Yeah.
And the schedule and the data. We have some criteria around that. The objective of this is not to get everything to green and always have it go there. The objective is, and you have to recognize, right? Like the process, it involves people, involves data, right? All the stuff's got to come together. And so there's going to be ebb and flow in every organization. It's not like once you get there, it's like staying in shape, right? It's not like once
Yeah.
I'm in shape, I get to stop doing all the stuff that got me there. It's you got to keep on that. And so this is just a way to say, can I score myself on here? And I can start to see, are we slipping in some areas? Is there a particular meeting that we're having problems where people are coming? Is data a problem for us? We
Well,
better.
and this is part of our report out in the uh, executive S&OP meeting. So there's an accountability there to the executive. Like
Yeah.
this meeting is not starting to be a red meeting for some reason. Or if it's red in all three categories, then
Yep.
who's doing what to fix it, kind of a thing. And not punitive, but just like let's fix this. There's
Right.
visibility of problems.
And if you think about going back to what I said about the executive S&OP meeting being that effective, short, focused, all of that sort of stuff, you need all of the meetings before that to be scoring pretty well in all of these areas because I got the right people in the room, they have the right information in front of them, and they're meeting regularly. I mean, if that's happening, I've got a good chance of being able to pull that off in the executive meeting. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think, and I think I covered all these, Marshall. I was gonna
Oh,
have you hold me responsible or accountable, I should say. Make sure I covered all of these things. Here would be my takeaways from this session today, right? Define clear ownership and the outcomes for each meeting. You kind of saw that documented as I went through there. That's an important thing to understand. Make sure people come prepared for the meeting. As I said, the demand meeting is not the first time you got together and tried to figure out what the demand plan looks like. The demand plan meeting is where you bring the input of your demand planning process, you're validating at the demand stream level, and you're basically signing off on that and making sure that's right. That might be the first time you see the backlog against the plan, but you've got to reconcile those things together, and that should be happening there. Um, Schedule the meetings well in advance. Your chances of things happening on a regular schedule are directly proportional to to actually having it scheduled out and making it part of your discipline. The other one I realized I didn't touch this one at all is allow time between the meetings to resolve issues. And what I mean
yeah.
by that is we'll often start working with someone and they say, we've got to get our S&OP process so we get through all of that meeting cycle in the first 3 days of the month. That's really, really hard to do and drive to improvement because if you think about it, I just captured my actuals from last month and I want to look at it compared to what happened what I planned. I need some time to dig into things that are out of tolerance. Like what exactly happened?
Yeah.
And so to me, it's more important to allow the time in between that than to really drive that cycle together. And
Yeah, it's hard to
usually,
do a thoughtful, non-reactive plan in a few days after
yep.
you're just digesting and
And I would say most businesses do a really good job of reacting to what's going on and meeting daily and meeting weekly. You've got all of those things happening. Think about this as the deep breath. Okay, I'm stepping back from the fray and I'm looking at what we said we were going to do and what happened. And I'm now thinking about what does that mean about the plan going forward. And I'll say it again, month one, the die is typically cast. You're in your react mode in month one, but month two and month three and month four, that's where you have the chance to start to change the plans, right? You don't think, oh my goodness, we've got demand going down. I want to change my marketing plan. I'm going to do it immediately in this month. And I think the effect is going to happen in the next week. I mean, if that happened, boy, that's fantastic. But typically that's a plan I'm putting out in the future. New product introduction would be the same thing, right?
right.
All of those sort of things. So instead of focusing on, I got to get the cycle really, really fast, think about making those meetings meaningful with good outcomes, right? With agreed upon plans so that you can come to the meeting. And I guarantee you that executive meeting will become more future focused, right? And it'll be a much more strategic meeting that you'll be able to go through. So to me, that's a real important one. And I think the
Good one.
final one is measure your performance. Once you got it documented, all that clear ownership, you know what's supposed to happen, measure your performance because the performance lapses will happen before the process starts to degrade, if that makes sense, right?
Right.
Same thing if you're just getting started, it's going to take you going through the cycle and making sure you're doing all the steps before you start to see the improvements. So
Yes.
that's kind of what I wanted to cover today, Marshall. I know I probably talked way too long, but
No, I probably asked you too many questions, but yeah, we try to keep these at 34, 5 minutes or 42, I think, but that's fine. Good stuff as usual, Doug. Excellent meat on the bone for understanding how to make the 4 meetings run well. And I just want to remind folks that the next one will be the next Thursday we're doing this will be the executive presentation, I believe you said.
Yep. We're going to dig into the presentation. So this is how do you get to that executive meeting prepared, and then the next session will be okay. Now you're prepared, but how do you actually present the story by family, right? Because that's so critical, right? Yeah.
And we should have by within a day or two have the assessment out there that we keep talking about. We meant to
Yep.
have it out by today, but I think it might take another day or two. But you can find the assessment when it's ready at bezaperformance.com or dbmsys.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe, or like and follow. Mash those buttons and follow us. That way it'll show up in your feed. I don't have to invite you to every single one of these. But with that said, we'll see y'all in 2 weeks with the executive uh, the executive meeting structure, and I'm sorry, the executive presentation. And thanks again, Doug.
All right.
All right, catch you later.
Yep. See you later, Marshall.